Hello everyone and welcome back to the Cyclocross Social podcast. The X2O Trophy has headed to Lokeren for the second round, and just like yesterday, with me here to discuss the action from the Duckies. The Duck is right there, but Issam on the other side of the screen. Thank you for being here once again.
Yes, thank you for having me.
The second round of the X2O Trophy took us to Lokeren, a race that got added to this series last year. We know it, of course, from the Belgian Championships here, the infamous incident right now. By this point, I think that's a fair description of the pit zone accident between Van Toerenhout and Zweek. Van Toerenhout going on to clinch the Belgian title. Zweek at two instances after that, mocking Van Toerenhout for that. That was all here on a slightly different course. Today we were racing on the same type of course as last year. Very, very technical. Since back then I think it was still called Brico Cross, I recall Mathieu van der Poel making a very nasty impact here on one of the ditches, and then the next day he still won in Gieten despite some speculation that he might be out for weeks. He was not hampered that much, but the course has become a lot more technical, and with this new date in November for the second year, a relatively muddy race. Let's dive into the action with the men's elite race. First, it was not the most tense race for the overall, because in the first lap we saw very quickly Niels van der Putten taking the initiative with Michael van Toerenhout. These two opened the gap over Laurens Zweek in third position and opened, I think, a 15-second gap by the end of lap 2. Van Toerenhout took over from Van der Putten. He set the pace, and quite quickly Van der Putten struggled. Thibaut Nys at that point was nowhere to be seen. He'd had a bad start, was somewhere around 15th place, moved his way up, but then started to have some mechanical issues. While the cameras were very focused on whatever was going on with Thibaut Nys, Joris Nieuwenhuis swapped positions with Niels van der Putten. Nieuwenhuis joined Van Toerenhout at the front. Van der Putten was kind of hanging there, but was now 10 seconds back. Nieuwenhuis took over about halfway through the race from Van Toerenhout, set a high pace for a few laps, managed to force a few errors on Van Toerenhout, who also just didn't have the legs to follow with him. Nieuwenhuis went on to take the win, with Van Toerenhout coming in second. Van der Putten fell back to a bigger group for third, with his teammate Jente Michels, but also Crelan Corendon duo of Emiel Verstringen and Laurens Zweek. But in the final lap, Van der Putten recovered just enough to take the lead of that group and bring home third place. Not that spectacular of racing, if you were to ask me, Issam. It was kind of what you can expect on a course like this. You call it a Mario Kart course if you want. Call it Monaco if you want. It's very, very technical. It requires a lot of skill. These short accelerations, there's a few sections where you can really put your power out. And what it does, it strings these groups. And for the tactic that Van der Putten and Van Toerenhout deployed, this was the perfect course. In lap 1, they set out and they know that all these corners will string the groups behind, and then it's just a matter of time before people don't have the legs to close the gaps anymore. And with Zweek, that happened very early, and from there it just went on. Nieuwenhuis was very impressive to make his comeback to the front, and he then deployed the same tactic. He just started pacing, and at some point Van Toerenhout was gapped. He came back, but then he can't keep doing that, so the gap at some point just snaps, and for Nieuwenhuis that resulted in an early victory, or he was sure of his victory relatively early, a comfortable win despite a crash late on.
This course is so difficult to make up position, and when you have a gap, it's for the chasers very hard also to make it up again. And that was the nature of this course, and that's how Lokeren is. It's just a lot of turning, a lot of you can see the riders, at least as a from a point of view for the fans, you can see the riders multiple times at certain points, and that's a good thing. But I think that kind of hurts the nature of the course. It's a bit meh, but it is what it is, and you have to deal with it, and every rider has to deal with that. And I think that Nieuwenhuis was today, compared to how he looked on the Koppenberg, he looked quite good. He was strong, and he was negotiating the course quite well. And up until that crash, I would say almost a faultless race, despite him not being at the front from the get-go, but he managed to do that quite quickly. And when he was there, it was just, Van Toerenhout gave a very good impression, but Nieuwenhuis was definitely able to put Van Toerenhout under pressure, and you could see that for Van Toerenhout, it seems to be that way, that he didn't really have an answer, and When you make small mistakes left and right, that gap just grows, and then it's just so difficult to make up the ground again. And Nieuwenhuis was just able to continue to extend that gap, and looked very good. And yeah, this was definitely, so far this season, this was the strongest race of Nieuwenhuis, and he looked very good.
Certainly, and in the last 2 episodes we made a point out of it to note that Overijse and the Koppenberg are not courses that suit Nieuwenhuis that well. He's not that much of a climber. Now he gets a more regular course. Of course, with the Mont Henri in here, they have a bit of climbing, but it's not remotely close to what they find themselves going up in Overijse or the Koppenberg. So it makes sense that he kind of is more in his zone here. He is in a more natural habitat here, if you want to put it that way. So he was good today. He said himself in the post-race interview that he was in the zone. He was just focused, locked in, and that's why he was so flawless in the first 8 laps, or 6 laps, I think. And in the last 2 laps, he said he kind of started thinking about the win and taking it easy and avoiding the risks, and that's when he then made a mistake. So from there on he tried to focus a bit more, but it was a really, really good outing by him. Again, what we discussed earlier, it seems to really be that he and Van Toerenhout are the 2 strongest riders so far this season. Van Toerenhout rebounds quite well from his bad day on the Koppenberg yesterday. I'm sure it also helped that he pulled out of that race relatively early, saving some energy perhaps compared to Niels van der Putte. Van Toerenhout, for that matter, did seem to kind of ease off in the second half of this race. Once he knew that Nieuwenhuis was gone, he knew he had a massive gap behind, so he decided, well, it's been good for today, and second place. So far, they both seem to be really on a roll this season, and perhaps the 2 favorites coming into the European Championships next week. Certainly with a lot of courage and confidence they will be heading there.
With this race, we should not forget about the race of Koppenberg and how much of an influence that actually can have on certain riders, because it's just also the one rider is not the other. It's also, it depends on how you actually went through that race. You know, Van Toerenhout got the okay from Mette Penningen to quit the race, and others maybe try to hang on and try to make something out of their day despite not having the best of legs, and despite having a course in front of them that is so tough, and that could play a role. And I think that maybe Nieuwenhuis and Van Toerenhout realized that there was not much to gain from the Koppenberg, made their decision, and were like, okay, today is maybe a day in which we can shine, and shining they did for sure.
Well, and adding to that is, of course, the starting contracts. There's a few riders who have a contract with the entire series, and I believe Nieuwenhuis and Van der Putte are 2 of them. Both of them are looking to secure the overall. Yesterday, Nijs won, of course. We know he's not going to do the entire series, but even then, like, Nieuwenhuis was quite far down, and now he's all of a sudden leading this classification. And for once, it's quite close after the Koppenberg, not for the least because a number of riders weren't fully going for it yesterday, but whatever, it's still close. I mean, Nieuwenhuis leads 40 seconds over Mason today. That's, I think, a rider for who you can say yesterday really took a heavy toll on them. It's not easy to go that hard on the Koppenberg, but for full reference, Nieuwenhuis 40 seconds on Mason, 41 seconds on Toon Aerts, 49 on Thibaut Nijs, who's not doing the entire series, and then Niels van der Putte is 5th, within the minute still, so that's perhaps a reason why a rider like Van der Putte did push on yesterday all the way to the end. Van Toerenhout doesn't really seem to care anymore. He lost a lot of time yesterday, but even he is at this point just 3 minutes 15 down. But I think for Van Toerenhout there are bigger goals. He wants to win the World Cup. He wants to try and win the Belgian title and, of course, the European title coming up, and perhaps push for that podium at the World Championship. So there's all these goals going through each other. Nieuwenhuis said his goal is, for instance, to win the X2O Trophy. His goal is, for instance, to become the world number 1 on the UCI ranking. So with those different goals, you can indeed see these different mentalities coming in. And if we're talking about mentality, a rider who we expected here at the front was Thibaut Nijs, Issam. There's been some criticism on his mentality after today's outing. People are calling him the Remco Evenepoel of cyclocross, that he's just making up excuses, but I'm not fully sure I personally agree with that narrative, because what happened today, he went into the pits, Then out of the pits there was this bump, and his hoods immediately came loose. His hoods were turning downwards. That's very, very hard to ride with. And then after the second pits, he still had some issues with it and needed to fix it. He did really put in a big push, but then started piling up the mistakes. It was not a good day out for him. I have no clue what on earth he was doing before the finish, coming into a surplus. I don't really know what was the thought behind that, but I think this narrative of Nijs being a bit of a quitter, we've left that in the past. His last 2 seasons were good, especially last year. He was really consistent. Once his season got underway, once he overcame that illness that he had, he was really consistent. His only phase of bad results was in that period after Lokeren in November, that phase in which he had bad luck seemingly every race. Once that bad luck stopped happening, I remember very well, I was in a hotel in Beringen. After Hulst, I said, Thibaut Nijs says he has good legs. I want to see it tomorrow. At some point, I can't keep taking these excuses from this happened or that happened. It needs to come. And guess what? It did. He finished on the podium in nearly every single race. He was second in Zonhoven. He was on the podium of the World Championships. I don't really think that that narrative is really correct anymore.
But it's all about the clicks, right? And it is an easy take to have, I think, because you can definitely use material from the race and use that in your favor. I think it all kind of started already with the bad start, and I think that set the tone for the race for Nijs, and it's just it didn't really go his way. And look, you can definitely make a point about when there are some things that don't really go your way. What is the mentality? Are you going to try and make something out of it? How are you affected by it? I think those are definitely somewhat fair assumptions to make, but to call him a quitter or to ridicule his race altogether, I mean, he made a joke out of it as well, especially with crossing the start finish line at the end. I don't really know what he was doing, but he was frustrated, and he to be honest, rightfully so. He can be frustrated about the material. The father of Thibaut, Sven Nijs, took because he had that problem with the shifter, and he took responsibility. And I think that you should not underestimate. As a rider, you have to have full trust in your equipment, and when that's not the case, it can really hurt the confidence of a rider. It can really hurt the motivation as well. He was already chasing. He was already not that good in the race, although from the moments that we could see him race, it didn't look that bad, to be honest. And it's a shame, really, that we were not able to see him up against Van Toerenhout and Nieuwenhuis, because I think that would have definitely made the race interesting, but also put that race of Koppenberg into a perspective that I would have loved to see. And now we didn't have that chance, and we have to wait and see. But I think that it, as I said again, it's easy to make those to have such a take and to be really on his case and be like, he's a quitter, he doesn't really want to give it all, and then when things go against him, he lashes out and all that kind of nonsense. But I think overall it is what it is. It didn't really go his way. You have those races once in a season, and we just have to see what comes next. But I think his form, nevertheless, is still going to be good, and he's definitely, we need to take him into account for the next coming races, because it seems to be that way, that his form is good, the legs are good, and things have to go his way.
The last thing I will say about it is that I think just his lap times tell you the story, right? So he goes into the pits, the shifters go down, then he goes onto a new bike. For some reason, his bars aren't straight aligned. They can say, oh, you should just ride with that, but if your bars are seriously misaligned with your front wheel, it's just near enough impossible to kind of do that. Then he gets a bike with a saddle which goes down. But as soon as he's on that blue bike with white bars, he really puts in a phenomenal charge to the front, really. I mean, he really goes all out. He comes from like 14th, 15th position, rides nearly to the group at the front, then makes a mistake. And I believe he later said that was the point where his saddle also went down, and it really went downhill from there. But he really still made an effort and could have, from that position, still finished on the podium, but he then just piled up the mistakes, which is probably tied into that frustration. But good I think Nice next weekend will be a quite dangerous contender for the European title. It will be interesting. We don't have much of a reference to go about, but let's look at the entire top 10. Joris Nieuwenhuis with the win ahead of Michael van Toerenhout and Niels van de Putte. Emiel Verstringen in 4th place ahead of Jente Michels. Toon Aerts came 6th ahead of Joran Viseuren with Laurens Zweek in 8th. 9th place went to Lars van der Haar and 10th went to Toon van der Bos. Let's zoom in a little bit on that battle for 3rd place, Issam. It was kind of a game by Niels van der Putte, right? He went quite deep early on in the race, then realized, well, this is not that wise for me to continue like this. But in the final lap, he clearly had something left in the tank, because as soon as Verstringen opened that little gap, he was the one to respond. He opened the gap relatively easy in that battle. He seemed to have just that little bit extra, and so far I would say it's kind of a trend, the rest of the top 10. We've seen this a number of times play out like this. Van der Putte is finished around the podium quite consistently so far. Verstringen underlines his performance from Overijssel last week, where he was in a battle against who again? Niels van der Putte, who was up there in the podium fight there. Jente Michels, and also kind of always finishing around that 5th, 6th place. And for the rest, again, we conclude what we've been concluding recently. Aerts, Viseuren and Zweek don't really have that little bit extra compared to those 3 guys ahead of them.
I think that for Van der Putte, it was a very wise decision to decide that it was going to be for 3rd. Because when you are going to get in such a chase with those 2 guys in front, where you already saw that it was not going to work out, and maybe you just, you give a little too much, and you don't have enough for the last 2-3 laps, and then it kind of doesn't go your way, and Verstringen is there and to take that podium. And I think that was a wise decision, because someone like Van der Putte on the last lap, hard to beat, and he showed that. So I think that is good, positive. And yeah, I mean, someone like Zweek today, I think was disappointing, because I felt like today was, the way he was starting, he was there up front. I thought, okay, this is a day where Zweek chose to be good, and he is going to be there up the front, and he might be able to fight for a podium, but he just doesn't have it, and we have seen it now a couple of times. And same goes, for example, for Toon Aerts, where we thought that maybe yesterday was going to be a race in which he could showcase good form, but he wasn't able to do that. And today was again a race for Aerts. I wouldn't say to forget, but he just never really played a role for a podium. And yeah, it is how it is, and there is not much you can do about it. You can only hope that the form gets better. But we are seeing now in the field certain patterns, and I think that we are getting to that point, after the European Championships, where we will see results that will not be that different from each other each weekend, up until maybe we get to December, and there are some certain riders that already thinking about the Christmas period and all that, and then it goes and it changes up again a little bit, and maybe some can make a step. But yeah, I think that we are, I wouldn't say stuck with it, but it seems to be that way, that at least for Aerts and also Viseuren and Zweek, those are just riders that they don't have enough to battle for a podium just yet in the current conditions with the current riders, if they all start.
Let's move on to the women's racing then, because that had a different dynamic to it. It was Sarah Casasola who put the rest under pressure in the first lap. She did so because Lucinda Braand had a weak start. She kind of missed her getaway and was around 8th position. She needed to move up because, as said before, this is a little bit of a Mickey Mouse course. It's very difficult to overtake. Casasola knew that, tried to take advantage of it, but didn't really succeed. Despite breaking away a few times, the others managed to come back, specifically on the second half of the course. The last section before the second sandpit had a bit more power, and there they really put in the effort. We went to a situation with 5 leaders. The aforementioned Casasola was joined by Van der Heijden, Braand, Van Alphen and Benveld. Just behind was Marion Norberry-Riberol, the Belgian champion. She was chasing, and as there was a bit of a waiting game at the front, she managed to join the leaders, and we got 6 leaders. Braand, she went into the pits, kind of made her life a bit more difficult with that, but eventually prevailed. She got to the second place of the leading group, closed the gap to Sara Casasola, who broke away with a 6-7 second gap at that point, but it was Braand from that point. Once Braand got over the early race mistakes, her bike change, she took the front, left the rest behind, went on to take victory. Behind, Casasola crashed in the sandpit, dropped to 6th place, but managed to fight back in the final lap. She sprinted for second against Marion Norbert-Ribeiro, a rider who wasn't really in contention for most of the race, but Ribeiro had more left in the final lap. The light slowly went out for riders like Bentveld and Van Alphen, but Ribeiro was there. The sprint was, however, quite weird. Casasola got into her pedals quite early after the sandpit, but then unclipped again. It was very hard to clip in. There were a lot of dismounts on this course, and then it was Ribeiro who came in for second ahead of her teammate Casasola. Issam, the difference today, in my opinion, but I'm curious how you think about it, was made by race adaptation. Adaptation to course conditions is something that I speak about a lot when I'm working for Eurocross Academy. When we work with these riders, I always put emphasis on adapting to the course there is in the conditions, and don't always try and stay on your bike. Sometimes it's better to dismount, sometimes it's better to ride, and if it's a 50-50, then it's most of the time better to run. That was today at the center of this course. When the women raced, the course was still a bit wetter. It had rained in the morning. And in the first laps, they were doing as many as 9 dismounts in the lap. There were the barriers, there were the stairs, and then there were all these other running sections. You saw at that point in the race that Braand and Bentveld both were struggling to adapt. The course was clearly different than it was in pre-ride. They were both trying to stay on their bike too much. They were trying to remount too early. As a result, Braand made her life very difficult. After that bad start, she didn't move up as quickly. After she had that bike change, she also made a few mistakes. Take, for instance, before the climb of Mont Henri, they had this weird 2 U-turns and then this long downhill to the bigger U-turn and the bigger climb. In this small section of U-turns, she tried to ride it, she tried to remount too early, she came to a standstill. On the climb itself at times, she was in too big of a gear. After they came back to the climb, at one point she was coming to a grinding halt, holding on to the pole because she remounted too early trying to ride a section. She made her life very difficult that way, also with that bike change. On the other hand, you had Bentveld. Bentveld was doing the same. She was making the same mistakes, trying to ride sections which she couldn't ride, needing to remount, losing all momentum. But Bentveld was up there. She was the perfect blocker for Casasola. Casasola was doing great in the first half. She was running these sections and that was clearly the best option. However, where it went wrong for Casasola was as this course dried up, the course came towards Braand and Bentveld. These sections that they couldn't ride in the beginning, like these 50-50 riding sections, became 60-40 riding sections. They could ride them. Meanwhile, Casasola kept running these sections. So you saw when Casasola broke clear that she couldn't keep that gap because she was running 2 sections which Braand and Bentveld were riding. From there it turned around. Casasola only made that switch in the last 2 laps after that crash, and that helped her kind of come back from 6th to 3rd. I think Casasola should have always finished 2nd here based on how she was doing overall, but that's kind of my takeaway. That's what I think today made the difference, and it felt a lot like last year's race because then Braand kind of saw a similar scenario unfold with a lot of chasing, bad start, difficult to overtake, but in the end also a win by roughly 20 seconds.
Yeah, I mean, I saw some footage of the pre-ride from the women's side, and you see just a totally different course, dry, and that obviously plays a big role in how you are interpreting the course and your reference overall, and you have to adapt. And I think that Casasola was maybe, you know, if you look afterwards, it was the smartest decision there to run, but with the information that you have in the pre-ride, obviously for them it looked like, why is she running? But it made sense because she was making up, you know, she was breaking away actually and running away literally from the competition. And I think that you have to adapt and you have to see that. And what I didn't really understand was you could see that it was working for, you know, a couple of hills and sections, and they didn't catch it immediately. They still tried to stay on the bike because, you know, some riders have the tendency to do more on the bike than start running because they don't really like the running, and the combination of it is also quite tough. So that also plays a role, but you could see that it didn't make sense to stay on the bike on certain sections, and they still did, and that played a role, especially for Casasola, the way she was riding in the first half, and she gave a very good impression. I think she had, besides Braand, the best legs, but then it just, a course like this, Lokeren, is just so tough, and then when you have just a couple of things that go against you, with the crash, your positioning, and then you got a Ribeirol that all of a sudden finds some legs, and then it goes down to a sprint. You're not able to clip in your pedal fast enough because of all the sand and stuff that is just stuck there, and there goes second place, and that's a bit of a shame. I don't think it's as bad as losing out on first. But yeah, it was a bit of a shame for Casasola. I think that Braand was really trying to sabotage her race in the first half, but then, yeah, finally was able to get to the front, knew that it was important to get to the front, and from there on it was basically her race to decide how she wanted to win, and decided to make sure that she got through the course safely, but fast enough for the others to not be in danger from the riders behind trying to make certain moves and that, and she got the gap and managed it super well. So I think, again, a strong race from Braand, and the others were not that far off, but I think that also had to do a bit with the course and how the race actually developed.
Self-sabotage by Braand. I'm sure we won't be reading that on the X2O website. I mean, the headline they ran there for their article on the women's race yesterday was interesting, to say the least. At what point does Golazzo kind of become the propaganda outlet for the team? Because they also own Balwaze Glowy Lions. They share a lot of sponsors, put them in packages together. But yesterday they ran a headline about the Koppenberg Cross. Braand crushes / demolishes young French rider Géry on Koppenberg. I don't know what race they watched this on, but that was not a demolition yesterday. I really don't know what to make of that, but I agree with your point today. Today it seemed like self-sabotage, and she eventually wins it just like last year. I do agree with your assessment that it was weird that she and Bentveld weren't really adapting. They saw riders past them making different moves. Casasola in the second half did adapt. So at some point she didn't really come to the realization herself, hey, at this point it's dry enough that I can do it. That's a really, really difficult call to make. She probably lacks the experience for that. I'm not going to be overly critic on her for that. I'm not going to criticize her too much for that move. But what I can say is that as soon as she found out, hey, this is not the right call I'm making, I see that other riders are quicker, she immediately changes plan, and it works out quite well for her. So her adaptation today was much better than the riders around her. That crash was just because she couldn't get out of her pedal. I don't think that was down to the sand skills. We saw a couple of good passages from her through the sand, a couple of weaker ones as well. Ribeirol, perhaps a bit of fatigue. That's kind of my only guess, that in the first half of the race that she kind of didn't have the full feeling for it like she did have yesterday, but that's my best guess. She kind of alluded to it afterwards that she didn't feel amazing all day, a little bit tired, tough weekend, but didn't have all too much to say on the performance, that it was really down to something. She kind of described it as the vibe was better in the second half, and that's, of course, as vague as you can get it for us. But nevertheless, it was a much needed up, because in Belgium they were already getting ready to write her off after being in sixth place for the first half of the race. They were sharpening their knives to write some fiery articles, but she saves the day.
She did, and yeah, I think it definitely probably had to do with the fact that just having those legs from after Koppenberg. That's not easy, to deal with, and certain riders, as I said before, they deal with it a little bit differently. She was not able to be up there immediately, and it took her time. But I think that if you look at her second half of the race, and especially that final part, it looked very fiery, and she had enough to make it Casasola difficult, and got herself in that position to fight for second, and eventually got second place. So I think it was a very strong ride, and it somewhat confirms what we have seen from Ribeirol in the earlier races, that she is definitely in good form. She's not better than Casasola, I think. But when it comes down to these type of finishes, and Casasola might have had a hiccup left or right, then Ribeiro is there to take that place. And yeah, it was again, I think, despite her bad start and the way that went, she was able to bounce back, and I think she saved her day. And also maybe an article left or right where they are losing the trust in Ribeiro altogether. So that was it. I think for her it also helps out, and she must feel good after that second place for sure.
And now I'm looking forward to reading the scenarios in which Ribeiro can become European champion, because that's the way it goes. Instead of being written off, it will now be, it's just a small step to Braand van Empel, ? So that's a nice dynamic to look forward to this week. You probably realize that it's hard to satisfy me because it's either too much of this or too much of that, but whatever. I always like these dynamics and they're interesting to follow, and even though sometimes they're a little bit unjust, it's fine. So let's look at the entire top 10, because Braand, Ribeiro and Casasola is a podium that we have seen, I believe, already this season, but I'm not entirely sure. Fourth place for Aniek van Alphen, continuing a strong season start. Bentveld, we discussed it for her as well. She was riding too many sections, kind of fell back. Like we saw in previous races, Issam, she was up there, but doesn't quite have the engine, it appears, to keep it up for the rest of the race. Van der Heijden, again, a bit of a colorless impression, 6th place. We discussed that extensively a number of times as well. Manon Bakker in 7th, ahead of Kristina Zemanova in 8th. Katablanka Vash in 9th, with Julie Brouwers completing the top 10. I believe only one rider here that we should discuss. That's a little bit of news compared to how we've been talking in the first couple of races of the season. Kristina Zemanova, the Czech champion. This is her first Belgian race of the season, I believe, and 8th place is solid. There's definitely still work to do for her. She had long COVID last year. It really hampered her. She's still not feeling 100% the same as she did before. It's a long way back, but this would, I say, be classified as encouraging. We know what's the type of course that suits her best. That's more the fast courses, the less technical courses. This is not one of those, but it's a fine start to this season. Let's call it that way.
Yeah, absolutely. I think that it is something you can build up on, and it was first outing back in such a field, and that is just also, you have to adapt a little bit, and then you now also know where you're somewhat at in terms of level, and you start to work on that. So I think for Zemanova, there is no reason to panic. It's a solid base, and from there you have to work and try to get better. And I think definitely that she can look ahead and set some goals and try to improve and get closer to the front, because I think she has it in her. It's definitely it's encouraging. It was not extreme, great, but it was a solid outing, and I think from here you can definitely build and have a very good base for the rest of the season for sure.
Let's discuss a few other results then. We still have a few points left from yesterday. Let's start with the race in the US in Northampton, a race that has returned to the calendar. Dylan Zakryzak taking the win in the men elite ahead of Tofik Bashir and Ryan Drummond. Henry Koot started his cyclocross season with a 4th place. He is coming back from a fractured vertebrae, which happened in mountain biking. On the women's side, Sydney McGill took the win in a close finish against Lizzie Gonzalez, with Cassidy Hickey coming in 3rd. Also, results that weren't in when we recorded yesterday were from Italy, from the Trofeo Città di Firenze, a race that takes place around the Mugello auto circuit. That will, of course, be news to your ears, Issam, because you are a big motorsport fan, for those who didn't know. It was Filippo Fontana taking the win there, ahead of Gioele Bertolini and Mattia Agostinacchio. I would like to take a brief moment here, Issam, to discuss Agostinacchio, because I know we touched upon him somewhat before, but I feel that he and Vietzi are both very raw talents. They are raw diamonds, but they both struggle with the same thing, and that's logical considering their age, but that's consistency. Vietzi, yesterday he was 2nd on the Koppenberg. Today he was 10th here in Lokeren in the U23 category. He was facing a lot of riders that didn't race yesterday. We've seen Vietzi do very well at the big stage, at the World Championships, for instance. I believe he was 4th there from the top of my head. He was up there in the World Cups. Agostinacchio, he won an elite race already. He beat Vietzi this season. He now is third, quite far behind Filippo Fontana. I don't want to draw too many conclusions out of it, but I feel both of them, if they can work on their consistency, they are great talents.
Yeah, absolutely. I think that it is for both riders. They are still at an age which it is acceptable that you're not that consistent, and that comes with experience, that comes with a multitude of races, and then you also kind of know the protocol, the routine, and you get somewhat more used to it. Because for some riders, it's also a shock to have a double weekend, or a very hard training week, and then you have to end it with a race, and it just at times it's just very difficult to be consistent at that age, and it's all part of the development, I guess. But for sure, if you look at the the potential that is there for both riders, I think that Italy has two great talents and riders that have the potential to make it very far in cyclocross on the men elite time side, and they could definitely be up there with the better riders. So I just hope that their development is not disrupted by anything, and that they are able to keep having fun and keep on developing. And that's the most important thing. You have to try to find the gains left and right, and that's what they have to do. And that's the journey that we are also going to try and follow them in and see where it all ends up. But it's great to see that Italy as a country has those two riders as talents that could potentially bring great results for Italy and for cyclocross overall internationally as well.
Certainly two talents, and I will be following them with a lot of interest this season and hopefully for many seasons to come. There was also a women's race there. Lucia Bramati took the win ahead of Carlotta Borello and Rebecca Gariboldi. Moving on to the races that took place today. Racing in Debrecen, Hungary, with Takart Zombor taking the win in the men elite race ahead of Brian Swider and Peter Soltes. In the woman elite category, it was Zuzana Kristalla taking the win ahead of Regina Prugnet and Erika Glazova. Then there was also racing in the UK. The men elite results are not in yet in full. I only saw on Instagram that it was Thomas Mean taking the win, his third win in the national series. He hasn't had that much luck yet over on the European mainland, but he is kicking it off in the series there. In the women elite race, it was Fionn Drake taking the win, ahead of Casey Eyington and Elena Day completing the podium there. In Spain, there was a broadcasted race. You can watch it back on YouTube if you want. In Carranza, it was González Higuaín Macho taking the win ahead of Mario San Milan, with Cyprien Gilles completing the podium. In the women elite race, it was Sofia Rodriguez Revers beating Anne Morichon and Sara Cueto Vega to the win. In Germany, a race all the way out in East Germany. This is, I think, the first Eastern German UCI race in nearly a decade, I believe, excluding the national championships. It took place at Chemnitz, a former cycling track. This one hosted the World Championships Derny, I think somewhere in the 60s when it was still part of the Soviet Union. And it was Hannes Degenkolb taking the win ahead of Matthias Fiala and Lars Sommer. Katarina Dudarova won the women elite race ahead of Anna Panusova and Judith Kral. Completing the results for so far, because the results from the Estonian Championships aren't yet in and the racing in Northampton Day 2 still needs to get underway, is a new race in France, in Langres. It was Theo Thomas taking the win ahead of Valentin Raymondet and Alexis David completing the podium. Another win on the women's side for Lynn Burquier, beating Amandine Vidon and Marlène Petit-Girard. With all those results, there's still one more point here, Issam, which I should mention. We have a little bit of news. I don't think there's too much to discuss, but we have injury reports. Alvarado and Vorst both were hoping to start their seasons in Tabor. That seems unlikely at this point. And then Eli Iserbyt, they were hoping to restart in Nîmes next week, but very worrying news coming from him. His narrowed arteries towards his leg have returned for, I believe this is now the fourth or the fifth time. And that might be a career-ending injury, but we don't know the details of that. Jurgen Mettepenning has said they were asking for a second opinion, more medical examinations to follow. He had a third surgery this summer that seemed to finally have done the trick for him, but at that point they also said And he said that in an interview, like, this was kind of my last resort. If it didn't work, then it was probably the end of my career. I can't really undergo these surgeries anymore. And now that it's returned, it's very worrying for him. They, as said, are undergoing further examinations. So that's a not so nice note to end this episode on. But I do thank you for your time. And we had a full weekend of X2O racing. And we will be back next week with a power ranking in the midweek and a preview for the European Championships.
Absolutely, and I'm looking forward to that. It's a shame, I think, for all riders that are currently injured, and especially that news about Iserbeat is somewhat worrying. I hope that it's that they eventually find a solution, find a way, because you don't want to end your career on this. It's. I think that he's getting through a tough time, so I hope he's able to recover. He's able to get back racing, do what he loves to do, and if that is on a similar level or just below that, you don't want to end it this way, so forced and unable to actually do something about it. So speedy recovery to all the riders that are injured currently, and hopefully they can get back to racing. And yeah, European Championships are up next, so I'm looking forward to that. So thank you for having me.
Let's indeed hope that everything works out in some way for Iserbeat, because it must be really difficult for him to go through those setbacks. The team said, if anything, they think he might be able to return to competition somewhere in January, not race the championships, just do a bit of racing for the feeling, similar to how Toon Aerts raced after his suspension. But let's focus on the European Championships. As said, a midweek episode coming up for us, and maybe next week I will finally get my first head-to-head between Lucinda Braand and Fem van Empel. The season is moving quickly. I was discussing it over lunch today. It's not long until the World Cup starts. We have one more weekend after the European Championships with 3 races. We have first Nieuw on a Tuesday, and then we have Hamme and Merckxplas in the weekend, and after that it's 3 single weekends. I feel like this season this is not really kicking off yet. It's not really going into motion yet, because we're missing all these head-to-heads, and there's few races where all the best riders have faced each other, but we are getting one next week in Middelkerke. Thanks everyone for listening. We will be back then. Goodbye.